What do you want to do with this little thief? Me and Lucy, we shot men, women, and children. So we sure.
Dying Light is the brainchild of Polish developer Techland. You are probably familiar with the studio's earlier projects, which included the Call of Juarez series and Dead Island. Dying Light, then, is meant to be the culmination of all of the knowledge Techland gained over the years spent developing Dead Island and the Call of Juarez titles. Dying Light was released on January 28, 2015 to mostly positive reviews. In it, the player takes control of GRE agent Kyle Crane and follows his story as he tries to survive in the fictional city of Haran. The story begins with a tense opening sequence that has Crane parachuting into the quarantined city after receiving his orders from the GRE, a shadowy government agency with unclear motives. Crane is tasked with a simple mission: recover a missing file from a fellow GRE agent gone rogue, Kadir Suleiman. After a botched landing sequence, he is saved by one of the main characters and is introduced to a group of survivors led by a parkour expert. After recovering from his injuries, Crane begins his task in earnest, thrusting the player into a survival action horror experience the likes of which we've never experienced before or since. Almost 6 years since launch, with Dying Light 2's status unclear and fans of the series anxiously awaiting any news at all, I find myself wondering if the original has aged as well as I'd hoped. Was it really as good as I remember? In this review, I am revisiting the streets of Haran to find out. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you my review of Dying Light.
Then head east. You'll see it. Loud and clear. Nice job.
Dying Light is a stunning game. It just looks great. Techland did a fantastic job making the city of Haran come to life. The textures pop and feel lifelike. There is great variation in the environment, character models are well done and look really good, and overall the art direction in the game is very well done. The city of Haran takes influence from Istanbul, Mumbai, Warsaw, Poland, and Brazilian favelas. The design and execution of the city of Haran feels like the crowning achievement of this title. The city feels real, it feels lived in, and like a real city, the environments and locations you visit are varied enough to keep the game feeling fresh even many hours into the playthrough. But creating a believable city was only one part of the equation. The next part was figuring out what that city should look like weeks into a viral outbreak that left most of the population transformed into flesh-eating zombies. If you stopped and considered what that would look like, what that place would be like after a sudden outbreak, I think Techland nails the atmosphere here. I mean, lights would stop on an instant, people would panic and try to flee obviously, some people would barricade themselves inside their homes and hope for the best. What would that be like to venture out into a city like that? Dying Light does a tremendous job of nailing that experience. As you make your way through the ruined city, you see all of these little touches that convey the panic and desperation of the people that lived in Haran. What their last moments were like as they rushed out of their apartments and desperately tried to survive the outbreak. It's a fantastic piece of world building and a nice follow-up to the Dead Island titles, which I felt were strong in this area as well, and it's great to see Techland building on that development knowledge for this title. The other component of the atmosphere is the audio in Dying Light. I think Techland did a really nice job here as well. Just listen to this gameplay clip. It's difficult to describe in words the intensity of moving through a dark apartment tower, listening for the sounds of zombies over the creaks of the building or the leaking of old pipes, anxiously awaiting the next encounter, or desperately trying to escape from a horde of volatiles at night and hearing the excited animalistic breathing of one in hot pursuit right behind me. It's hair-raising stuff. Speaking of night, when the sun goes down in Haran, the real boogeymen of the game come out to play. In case you thought all you had to worry about were zombies and Rice's goons, well, you're in for a treat. The volatiles and the evolved volatiles you encounter later in the game are basically super zombies out of your worst nightmares. They are super strong enemies with a ton of HP, they're extremely fast, high jumping, and can use tendrils to quickly move around the environment. In a word, terrifying. These special night enemies combined with the pitch blackness of night in Dying Light is a very effective game mechanic. The developers were quoted as saying the day-night cycle would be like having, quote, 2 games in one box. And while the net effect isn't quite that, it does add a fun dynamic to the gameplay and does lend some urgency to the game when the player is out completing missions and tasks.
I'm not gonna bother learning your name till you survived a few days, but here, this is for you.
Fuck, what is this?
Combat in Dying Light picks up where Techland left off in the Dead Island games. This is a major area where Techland felt that the combat system in Dead Island was fundamentally sound enough to transfer to Dying Light, albeit with some marked improvements. Techland invited Krav Maga experts to show the development team what it was like to hit something. They wanted to give the combat the weight that Dead Island was missing. I think they succeeded in that respect. Combat, especially early in the game when you are armed with very primitive weapons, feels chaotic and exhausting. The main character is a low level and the enemies are difficult to bludgeon to death with a wrench. This makes sense, and it makes the combat feel more significant and forces the player to make the choice to favor their parkour abilities early on rather than take on groups of enemies with a broomstick. In Dead Island, you could fight off a large group of zombies with nothing but a broomstick, basically as soon as the game started, and in that way, Dead Island was much more of an arcade experience. Dying Light, with the changes to the combat system and the addition of the parkour element, has much more of a survival element baked in right at the start as you're forced to flee from groups of enemies because you're outnumbered and ill-prepared. As I mentioned previously, the parkour element that Techland chose to include in Dying Light is what makes the evasion possible. I want to start by saying that I absolutely love the parkour element of this game. Techland hired a parkour expert to make the parkour as realistic as possible, and I think it paid off. They also adopted a freeform approach to the parkour system during development and abandoned the idea to base the parkour mechanic on a hook system, which, like Mirror's Edge, would have allowed players to interact with hooks on specific rooftops and walls. They decided to move away from this because it posed a significant development challenge. Ultimately, I think it's safe to say that they made the right choice. A hook system would have limited the player's movement to a point where it would have made the game extremely tedious and frustrating. Instead, we get this very fluid and dynamic movement system that feels much more realistic, and it makes the game more dynamic by giving freedom to the player to approach situations and encounters differently, and this adds to the overall entertainment value of the game. I mean, this can't be understated. There's just nothing quite like an intense parkour run at night while being chased by volatiles. Techland really hit it out of the park with this aspect of gameplay, and it should be recognized. Obviously, there are some minor issues. Sometimes the parkour elements can be a bit janky. There are some minor glitches, but overall, it's a very solid parkour gameplay experience. The game features a crafting system that relies upon the player collecting numerous parts and materials around the game world. The crafting system was overall pretty painless. Materials are not overly difficult to come by, and the game makes it very simple for the player to understand what they can craft and what they are missing and still need to collect. Now, normally I'm not a huge fan of crafting systems, so there is some bias here, mostly because I find them to be tedious and distracting from the experience. However, I have no problem with them when they are done well, or at the very least don't interfere with my enjoyment of the game. For Dying Light, I found that the system was mostly additive to the experience and didn't distract me much from the main experience or hinder my progress in any real way, so I didn't really mind it. It's nothing groundbreaking, but at least it wasn't distracting.
I'd like you to craft something for me.
The final aspect of gameplay I want to touch upon is the leveling and progression system. Dying Light uses a skill-based progression tree as the main leveling system. There are 3 main categories you need to worry about: survivor rank, agility level, and power level. Survival level is based on survivor points, which you can earn by completing missions and quests, also by completing random encounter events out in the world and surviving night cycles and pursuits. Agility points are gained by performing parkour moves, like climbing and jumping. Power points are earned in combat, fighting and killing your various foes. As you level up in each area, you gain skill points that can be used to unlock special abilities in each respective area. These unlocks include things like the ability to craft new items, health and stamina boosts, grappling moves and parkour abilities, and combat abilities. Overall, the system is decent. I think there is some room to add more abilities that have a little more utility and some more depth to the playstyle ramifications that the choices in the trees lead to. The unlocks in the skill trees as they stand feel slightly rewarding and add to the player experience, but I wish that these choices had more weight. For example, one skill path might lead to the player being a blunt weapons expert, one path might lead to blade or ranged. There might be a path for strength focus or speed focus, but there is none of that, which, especially in the late game, make the skill trees feel shallow, arbitrary, and meaningless in terms of overall gaming experience. Let's talk about plot.
The creation of one's own rules, that is what makes a man. Do you live by your own rules, Crane? Or are you merely someone else's puppet?
The plot in Dying Light is bittersweet. On the one hand, you are grateful for its presence in the game, if for no other reason than that it compels you to go out into the game world and explore what Techland has created in this title. I mean, the game world, as we've discussed, is stunning. And to put into context what I'm about to say, it's not that the plot is unbearable. It is, for the most part, serviceable, but it could have been so much more. There is just so much that is wrong with the way the studio handled the plot that it ruins key moments of the experience for the player. Moments that are supposed to reward the player for the time that they've spent with the game. I'm sure all of us gamers can think of iconic moments in games that stick with us because they were shocking or so compelling to the point that you couldn't forget them, and those moments stick with you long after you've left the game world. Dying Light gives you very little in return for the hours it demands from you as a player. And this brings us to the main issue. I mean, when it comes down to it, Dying Light is just an extremely vapid game. And I know some people will say that it's just a mindless action arcade zombie game and I should just enjoy it for what it is and move on. And I get that sentiment. I do. If we were talking about Dead Island, I would absolutely agree with you, but when it comes to Dying Light, I don't agree. See, this game had the potential to be genre defining, and I think it still might be in a way. Regardless, the game's plot actively tries to be a serious one. Techland wasn't trying to convey an arcade type feel with this writing. That is the very reason Dying Light wasn't a follow-up to Dead Island. I mean, Techland wanted to prove that they could make a AAA title with a serious tone and pull away from the work they did with Deep Silver on Dead Island. In a 2013 interview with Eurogamer, producer Timon Smektela said, quote, "It's more mature and more serious, I think. People will be surprised by our story to some extent," end quote. See, Dying Light is a story-driven action survival game with RPG elements. Keywords there are story-driven. That means that the very thing that is supposed to keep the player interested and invested is the compelling story beats that push the narrative and action forward. Without giving away spoilers, there are several plot beats in this game that were meant to provide emotional resonance that simply fall flat due to poor, rushed writing and little to no character building. We meet a slew of characters in this game, and almost all of them come off as flat, underdeveloped plot devices. And that's not to say that there aren't high points. Throughout the plot, there were several times when I thought, this bit is really good, or wow, I wonder what else this character has to offer. Sadly, these are just momentary flashes of brightness in an otherwise bland and lifeless plot. I mean, there's just nothing going on under the surface. And this is the fundamental flaw of this game. And what about Kyle Crane, our protagonist? Is he the saving grace that keeps us entertained and invested in his outcome through his witty banter and great personality and interesting character development? This is not even close to reality. Crane comes off as bored, cliche, and downright lifeless at times. To make matters worse, Crane makes some inexplicably foolish decisions as a means of keeping him in tow of the ham-fisted plot, and this makes him really unlikable. And what would it have taken to fix this mess of a plot? I mean, there are really two ways to look at it. For one, better writing. If Techland was set on a linear plot, then at least put the effort in to make it a good, believable one with fully fleshed out characters and actual stakes. Give us some time to get to know and grow attached to the characters, to feel connected to our protagonists and to actually care about whatever our task is. Beyond an overall better plot, what the game really needs is choice.
All of this, and still you had your choice made for you. Disappointing, Crane.
Some sliver of agency would have made the game demonstrably better. The main antagonist, Rice, mocks Crane for being a puppet several times, for having no agency, and he is exactly right. The game needed a choice system. It needed consequences that the player felt somewhat responsible for, even if it was just an illusion. It needed deeper customization of player character builds and playstyles. It needed you, the player, to not be a casual observer to the subpar writing that was passing you by on the way to an unsatisfying ending. Of course, there are arguments for and against more RPG elements, and I'm not sitting here comparing Dying Light to The Witcher 3 by any means, nor am I suggesting the two games are or should be similar. They are very different games, but in a game like Dying Light where the core gameplay loop gets stale fairly quickly, the developers have a responsibility to the consumer, you and me, to deliver a fantastic story. A lot of people will say that it's perfectly acceptable to have a so-so plot if your gameplay is decent. This is nonsense. We don't accept movies with bad plots if the cinematography is really good. The same should hold true for games, which, even in the age of multiplayer and looter shooters, still need to tell a great story. All of this to say, Techland missed the mark with this story. This is frustrating because it's not what they set out to do, and frankly, the game would have been so much better had they given the plot a bit more thought and care. Despite its flaws, I'm a huge fan of Dying Light, and I think Techland is a fantastic studio. Techland has shown that they are able to grow and develop their ideas into a more complex and valuable experience for the end user. Dying Light will always have a place in my heart as it really broke new ground into what a zombie game could be, and I hope to see them take what they've learned from the original and apply it to the sequel. After revisiting Dying Light, I think I now understand what made it so attractive back in 2015. It is a solid action survival game, with great mechanics and a stunning world to explore. Techland was able to take the fun of an arcade title like Dead Island and morph that concept into something truly unique and memorable. The plot is forgettable, but the gameplay and the world the game inhabits is not. Throughout your time in Haran, you'll do a lot of fighting and traversing. You'll cross many rooftops. You'll have fun doing it. You'll recall a lot of your close encounters and crazy night runs. You just won't remember the reasons or the moments that caused all of the fighting and traversing in the first place. And if you're okay with that, then there is some fantastic gameplay and experiences to be had out in the city of Haran.
Haran's days are numbered.